My name is Mila Joan, and I am 22 years old, and a month ago I stood on the polished mahogany commencement stage of Sinclair University as the class valedictorian, my gold stole heavy against my shoulders, staring directly into the eyes of the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to delete my existence. My mother, Caroline Joan, sat in the third row of the expensive folding chairs, her fingers white-knuckled as she clutched a stolen invitation she had likely swiped from our neighbor's mailbox, weeping silent, performative tears into a silk handkerchief that cost more than my first month of groceries. She was crying because her golden son, my brother Julian, was currently at home in his stained undershirt, nursing a hangover from a night spent celebrating a dead-end $14 an hour job at a local car wash, while I was being scouted by 3 Fortune 500 firms with starting offers that made her annual alimony look like pocket change. But before I tell you about the 5-year war that led to that stage, you need to understand the day the foundation of my life was systematically dismantled by the people who were supposed to protect it. It was a Tuesday in late August of 2019, the air in our West Hartford home thick with the scent of expensive Joe Malone sea salt candles and the oppressive humidity of a Connecticut summer. I was 18 years old, standing in the kitchen of our colonial-style house on Sycamore Drive, a property valued at $850,000, holding a thick envelope from the University of Pennsylvania. I had worked 3 part-time jobs during high school, including a grueling stint at a local diner and 12-hour shifts at a dusty logistics warehouse in East Windsor, just to pay for my SAT prep and application fees. When I opened that letter and saw the word congratulations, I thought the weight I had been carrying since I was a child had finally evaporated. I showed the letter to my father, Marcus, who was busy checking the stock prices on his dual-monitor home office setup, and he didn't even look up from the glowing green lines of the S&P 500. He just told me to talk to my mother about the tuition deposit. I found Caroline in the sunroom, sipping a chilled glass of Whispering Angel Rosé that cost $42 a bottle, her legs crossed elegantly as she scrolled through a luxury travel blog. When I placed the acceptance letter on the glass coffee table, she didn't smile, she didn't hug me, and she certainly didn't offer a toast. Instead, she set her glass down with a precise, chilling click and looked at me with a level of disdain usually reserved for a stain on the rug. She looked me in the eye and said, "Why would I waste a $112,000 education on a girl who is destined to flip burgers, Mila? You are not college material, you are a liability. And quite frankly, your father and I have decided that every cent of the college fund is being redirected to Julian's business venture." Julian was 20 at the time, a boy who had been expelled from 2 private academies and whose only business venture was a failed attempt to sell counterfeit sneakers out of the trunk of his 2018 midnight blue BMW 3 Series. The contrast was a physical ache in my chest. I had a 4.2 GPA, a stack of recommendations from every teacher I'd ever had, and a work ethic forged in the heat of a warehouse where the temperature regularly hit 95 degrees. Julian had a sense of entitlement that could fill a stadium and a habit of losing 4-figure sums at underground poker games in New Haven. That afternoon, my mother didn't just deny me an education, she erased my future with the stroke of a metaphorical pen. She told me I had 48 hours to pack my things because they were converting my bedroom into a trophy room for Julian's sports memorabilia and a home gym with a $5,000 Peloton bike and a full set of Rogue fitness weights. I left that house with 2 battered suitcases, a 2012 Honda Civic with a dented fender and a transmission that groaned every time I hit 40 miles per hour, and exactly $843 in my savings account at People's United Bank. I didn't cry when I backed out of the driveway, even as I watched my mother through the window, already directing the movers to carry my desk to the curb. I drove straight to the only place that had ever given me a paycheck without a lecture, the Miller Logistics Warehouse on the outskirts of Windsor Locks. It was a massive, gray, corrugated metal beast of a building, stretching over 200,000 square feet, filled with the constant mechanical hum of conveyor belts and the beep, beep, beep of Hister forklifts moving pallets of electronics and medical supplies. The manager, a man named Silas who smelled of stale coffee and diesel fuel, looked at me through the glass of his cramped office and asked why I was back when I was supposed to be heading to some Ivy League school. I told him the truth, that the Ivy League was a dream I couldn't afford and that I needed 40 hours a week, plus every minute of overtime he could throw at me. He gave me a high-visibility vest that was 3 sizes too big and a pair of steel-toed boots that cost me $98 of my remaining cash, and he put me on the night shift. For the next 2 years, my life was a symphony of industrial noise and physical exhaustion. I spent my nights from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. scanning barcodes, wrapping pallets in heavy-duty stretch film, and hauling boxes that weighed 40 pounds each. My hands grew calloused, my fingernails were perpetually stained with warehouse dust, and my back ached with a dull, rhythmic throb that became my constant companion. I lived in a 300-square-foot studio apartment in a dilapidated brick building in New Britain, where the rent was $950 a month and the radiator hissed like a dying animal all winter long. My dinner was usually a $3 grocery store rotisserie chicken or a bowl of generic brand oatmeal. I didn't buy new clothes, I didn't go out for drinks with friends, and I certainly didn't check social media to see photos of Julian at beach clubs in the Hamptons, funded by the money that was supposed to be my tuition. But while my body was working the line, my mind was building an empire in the shadows. I began to notice the inefficiencies in the warehouse's routing system, the way the shipping manifests were handled, and the thousands of dollars being lost every month due to poor inventory management and outdated software. I started taking night classes at the local community college, paying $380 per credit hour in cash. I would finish my shift at 6 a.m., drive to the campus in my rattling Honda, and sit in the back of a lecture hall smelling of industrial soap and sweat, taking notes on supply chain management and data analytics. While my mother was hosting charity galas and bragging about Julian's supposed progress in the tech world, I was teaching myself SQL and Python on a refurbished Lenovo laptop I bought for $200 at a pawn shop. I wasn't just a laborer anymore, I was a spy in the House of Commerce. I spent my lunch breaks, which consisted of 20 minutes sitting on a plastic crate eating a ham sandwich, analyzing the warehouse's throughput. I realized that if Silas implemented a cross-docking system and updated his ERP software, he could increase his profit margins by 15%. One rainy Tuesday in November, when the warehouse floor was slick with tracked-in mud and the tension was high because a major shipment of surgical components was 4 hours behind schedule, I walked into Silas's office. I didn't ask for a raise, and I didn't complain about the broken heater in the break room. I handed him a 12-page proposal I had written between shifts, detailed with color-coded charts and a projected ROI that would make a venture capitalist weep. He looked at the paper, then at my grease-stained vest, and then back at the paper. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked where I learned how to calculate a weighted average cost of capital. I told him I learned it while he thought I was just flipping boxes. 6 months later, Silas promoted me to operations coordinator. My salary jumped from $15 an hour to $55,000 a year. It wasn't the $100,000 I would eventually make, but it was enough to enroll full-time at Sinclair University, a private institution known for its rigorous business program. I didn't tell my parents. I had blocked their numbers the day I moved out, but I heard whispers through distant relatives. I heard that Julian's business venture had collapsed after he spent $60,000 on an office lease in downtown Hartford that he never actually used. I heard that my father's firm was struggling after a series of bad bets on retail real estate. I heard that my mother was still telling everyone that I was living in a commune in Vermont, too embarrassed to admit she had kicked her valedictorian daughter to the curb. Every day at Sinclair was a battle. I was older than my peers, my hands were rougher, and my eyes were tired from the years of night shifts. While the other students complained about the price of lattes at the campus Starbucks, I was calculating the shipping costs of those very same coffee beans. I treated every assignment like a multi-million-dollar contract. I didn't just pass my exams, I demolished them. When the time came for senior internships, I didn't apply for the local firms. I went for the giants. I used my real-world experience at the warehouse to land a position at a global logistics firm in New York City, commuting 3 hours each way on the Metro North train, studying on the bumpy ride while others slept. The day of graduation, the sun was a searing white disk in a cloudless Connecticut sky. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the expensive perfumes of the wealthy families gathered on the quad. I stood backstage, adjusting my mortarboard, feeling the weight of the silver valedictorian medal around my neck. I had seen the guest list, and I knew my mother had somehow secured a ticket, likely through a friend whose son was graduating in the bottom half of the class. She didn't know I was the speaker. She didn't even know I was a student. She likely expected to see me in the crowd, a failure she could pity from a distance. When the dean announced my name, the silence that fell over the crowd was, for me, the loudest sound in the world. I walked to the podium, the heels of my black pumps clicking against the wood, and I looked down. There she was, Caroline Joan, wearing a pale yellow Chanel suit that cost $4,000, her face frozen in a mask of absolute, unadulterated shock. Her jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to lose its structural integrity. Beside her, my father looked like he had seen a ghost, his face a pale shade of gray that matched his expensive suit. They watched as I spoke about the resilience of the human spirit, about the difference between a legacy given and a legacy earned, and about the fact that a $112,000 education is worthless if the person receiving it has no soul. I didn't look away from her once. I wanted her to see the girl she called a liability, the girl she thought was destined for a fast food counter, standing at the pinnacle of the very world she worshipped. As I finished my speech, the applause was a deafening roar, but all I could hear was the quiet internal shattering of the lies she had built her life upon. Family isn't the name on your birth certificate or the person who pays for your first car. Family is the grit in your bones and the people who stand by you when the lights go out. And as I walked off that stage, I realized I had never been a liability. I was always the most valuable asset in the room. In our 1,800-square-foot colonial home in West Hartford, Connecticut, a property that my mother, Caroline, treated more like a museum of her own social aspirations than a place of refuge, there was a clear and devastating hierarchy that dictated every breath we took. My brother, Chase, who was 19 and possessed a sense of entitlement that seemed to grow in direct proportion to his failures, was the family investment, while I was nothing more than the overhead, a line item to be reduced, managed, and eventually deleted. To maintain the illusion of Chase's impending greatness, my mother took out a second mortgage on the house, specifically an $82,500 home equity line of credit from Liberty Bank, just to fund what she called Chase's elite prep year after he spectacularly failed his first round of SATs with a score that wouldn't have gained him admission to a local technical college. That money, which could have paid for my entire 4-year degree at a state university twice over, was siphoned into private tutors who charged $250 an hour to sit in our dining room and watch Chase play Fortnite on his high-end Alienware gaming laptop. Meanwhile, I navigated the hallways of our home like a ghost in $4 thrifted sweaters that had lost their shape 3 owners ago, working 25 hours a week at a cramped retail shop in the West Farms Mall. I meticulously saved every cent of my $12.50 hourly wage, stuffing the crumpled bills and heavy coins into a rusted metal lockbox that I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard under my bed. A secret treasury that represented my only hope of ever escaping the suffocating weight of my mother's disdain. To my mother, my only tangible value was the manual labor I could provide, a source of free domestic services that allowed her to spend more time obsessing over Chase's non-existent academic progress. I was the one tasked with scrubbing the white wooden baseboards of our home with a pungent solution of diluted bleach and warm water at 6 a.m. every Saturday morning, the chemical fumes stinging my eyes and turning the skin on my knuckles raw and red. While I was on my hands and knees in the cold dimness of the downstairs hallway, Chase was upstairs, buried under 800 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets that my mother had purchased from Bloomingdale's for $340 as what she described as a motivation gift to help him rest his brilliant mind. The contrast was a physical weight, a suffocating realization that in this house comfort was earned by the son who did nothing, while the daughter who did everything was treated like an unwanted tenant. My mother would walk past me while I was cleaning, her silk robe fluttering around her ankles as she carried a tray of organic blueberries and artisanal Greek yogurt up to Chase's room, never once acknowledging the fact that I had been awake for 2 hours, ensuring that the house met her impossible standards of perfection. She would often comment on how lucky I was to have a roof over my head, completely ignoring the fact that I was the one who mowed the lawn with our aging Toro walk-behind mower, the one who shoveled the heavy New England snow from the driveway before the sun came up, and the one who handled the grocery shopping with a strict budget that she monitored down to the last penny, often accusing me of wasting money if I dared to buy a brand of toothpaste that wasn't on sale. The financial disparity in our household was a calculated form of psychological warfare, designed to make me feel small and insignificant, while Chase was inflated into a god of the household. When Chase decided he needed a car to get to his prep classes, despite the fact that they were only 3 miles away, my mother didn't hesitate to lease a 2023 jet black Jeep Grand Cherokee for $680 a month, citing safety and the need for a reliable vehicle for her golden boy. I, on the other hand, was told that if I wanted to get to my job at the mall, I could either walk the 45 minutes in the Connecticut humidity or use my savings to fix the rusted-out bicycle I found in the garage, which had 2 flat tires and a chain that slipped every time I tried to go uphill. Every interaction in that house was a reminder that I was a liability, a drain on resources that were better spent on a son who had mastered the art of failing upward. My mother would spend hours in the kitchen, carefully preparing high-protein meals for Chase because he complained that the prep classes were draining his energy, while I was left to scrounge for leftovers or make do with a 5-cent packet of instant ramen that I ate in the laundry room to stay out of her sight. I remember one specific evening when I came home from a double shift at the retail shop, my feet aching and my head throbbed from the constant neon lights, only to find my mother and Chase looking over a brochure for a $20,000 summer internship program in London that was essentially a luxury vacation disguised as a career booster. When I mentioned that I had been accepted into a local community college honors program and needed just $500 for the deposit, my mother didn't even look up from the brochure. She simply told me that I was being selfish for asking for money when Chase's future was at such a delicate turning point. That was the environment that forged my resolve, a cold and clinical setting where love was a currency I didn't possess, and where my worth was measured in the gallons of bleach I used and the hours of overtime I clocked. I became a master of the shadows, learning to exist in the margins of their lives while I built my own internal fortress. I used the quiet hours of the early morning, after the baseboards were sparkling and before the rest of the house stirred, to study from discarded textbooks I found in the library's free bin, teaching myself the intricacies of logistics and supply chain management because I saw the way the world moved products, and I knew that was my way out. I watched the delivery drivers who brought Chase's constant stream of Amazon packages, noting the brands of the trucks, the efficiency of their routes, and the way the local distribution centers operated on a clockwork schedule that my mother's chaotic household could never understand. I began to see our house not as a home, but as a failing enterprise where the management was corrupt and the star employee was a fraud, and I knew that eventually the market would correct itself. I kept my head down, my thrifted sweaters pulled tight against the drafts of that big colonial house, and I counted every dollar in my rusted lockbox with a religious fervor, knowing that each $10 bill was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the woman who looked at me and saw only a liability. My brother's elite prep year was a farce of expensive tutors and missed appointments, a $82,000 gamble that my mother took with the very foundation of our home, all while I was treated like a servant who should be grateful for the crumbs. I recall a moment when the air conditioner in the house broke during a heat wave in July, and instead of using some of the credit line to fix it, my mother bought Chase a high-end portable cooling unit for his bedroom and told me that the heat would build character and help me focus on my chores. I sat in my tiny, sweltering room under the eaves of the roof, the temperature reaching nearly 90 degrees, and I didn't cry because I didn't have the energy to waste the salt. I just opened my lockbox, felt the cold metal of the rusted lid, and reminded myself that one day I would be the one holding the keys to an empire while they were left wondering how the girl who scrubbed their floors had managed to move the world beneath their feet. Every insult, every overlooked achievement, and every dollar spent on Chase was fueled into a quiet, burning ambition that didn't need Egyptian cotton sheets to sustain itself. I was learning the value of $1 the hard way, by earning it 12.5 at a time, while my mother was learning how to bankrupt her future for a son who couldn't even bother to wake up before noon. The hierarchy of Sycamore Drive was set in stone, but stones can be broken, and as I polished the silver that we only used when my mother wanted to impress neighbors she didn't even like, I realized that I wasn't the overhead. I was the only person in that house who actually knew what it cost to survive. The weight of that $60,000 debt from the home equity line was a silent predator in our house, one that my mother ignored while she continued to buy Chase premium memberships to fitness clubs and expensive steak dinners to reward him for simply attending a tutoring session. She would sit at the mahogany dining table, the same one I had waxed until I could see my own exhausted reflection, and talk about Chase's potential as if he were a rising star in the firmament, while I was tasked with clearing her wine glass and ensuring the dishwasher was loaded perfectly. I began to realize that her hatred of me wasn't about my lack of potential, but about the fact that I was a constant, living reminder of the reality she was trying to escape. A reminder that hard work and sweat were the true drivers of life, not second mortgages and borrowed prestige. My existence challenged her narrative of effortless grace, and so she tried to bury me in bleach and thrift store wool, never imagining that the girl she was trying to break was actually being tempered like steel in the furnace of her neglect. I would lie awake on my old, thin mattress, listening to the hum of Chase's Alienware computer through the wall, and I would visualize the logistics of my departure, calculating the exact amount of money I needed to get a deposit on a studio apartment and cover my first semester of tuition. I wasn't just a daughter in a colonial house in Connecticut. I was a strategist behind enemy lines, and every 6 a.m. scrubbing session was a tactical exercise in endurance that my mother, in all her silk-robed arrogance, was inadvertently providing for my future success. The ultimate betrayal, the moment the thin veneer of familial duty finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, happened on a Tuesday in early February at exactly 6:14 p.m. The digital clock on the microwave, a base model Whirlpool that hummed with a low, irritating vibration, blinked the time in neon green digits as I stood in our kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously preparing my application for the free application for federal student aid, known as the FAFSA, because I knew that without government grants and subsidized loans, my dream of escaping this colonial prison and attending a university with a reputable logistics program would remain nothing more than a hallucination. All I needed from my mother, Caroline, were her tax returns and a signature on a single digital form, a procedural necessity that required nothing from her but a few moments of her time and the acknowledgement that I existed as her daughter. I approached her while she was leaning against the scuffed laminate counters of our kitchen, the beige surface stained with a ring of red wine from her glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, and I asked her as calmly as I could for the documents. Caroline didn't just say no. She didn't offer an excuse about being busy or suggest we talk about it later. Instead, she let out a laugh, a cold, hollow, and sharp sound that echoed off the cabinets and seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the room. It was a sound of genuine amusement at the absurdity of my ambition, a sonic manifestation of the contempt she had been nurturing for 18 years. Before I could even process the cruelty of that laugh, her hand shot out with the calculated precision of a predator and snatched my $35 SAT prep book, a heavy paperback with dog-eared pages and hundreds of my own handwritten marginalia, and with a flick of her wrist, she swiped it into the grease-stained trash can nestled under the sink. The book landed with a dull thud atop a pile of discarded coffee grounds and eggshells, a symbolic burial of the future I was trying to build for myself. She stepped toward me, the scent of expensive wine and Joe Malone perfume clashing with the sterile smell of the diluted bleach I had used to scrub the floor earlier that morning, and her eyes narrowed into slits of pure ice. "Every cent of our credit belongs to Chase," she hissed, her voice dropping into a low, venomous register that made the hair on my arms stand up, and she leaned in so close I could see the fine lines of resentment etched around her mouth. "Go to cosmetology school, or get a permanent shift at the diner down the road, Mila, because I am not signing a single document for you, nor am I providing a single financial record that would allow you to milk the system on our behalf." As she spoke, my brother Chase sat at the mahogany breakfast bar just 3 feet away, his long legs stretched out in front of him, wearing a pair of $200 Nike Tech fleece joggers that my mother had bought him the previous weekend as a reward for merely waking up before noon. He was smirking, a slow, ugly expression of triumph that made his soft features look grotesque, and he didn't even look up from the screen of his brand-new $1,200 iPhone 15 Pro Max in natural titanium. I had seen the receipt for that phone sitting on the counter earlier that day, tucked under a pile of mail, a blatant testament to the fact that there was plenty of money for toys and vanity, just none for my survival. The weight of that moment was suffocating because I realized they weren't just denying me money or a college fund. They were systematically denying me a legal identity and the right to participate in the world as an independent adult. By refusing to provide the tax information required for the FAFSA, Caroline was effectively barring me from every accredited institution in the country, chaining me to the floorboards I spent my mornings scrubbing. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was ensuring that I remained the domestic overhead, the invisible servant who kept the colonial house on Sycamore Drive running while she and Chase lived off the hollow promises of a second mortgage. I looked at the trash can where my future lay buried under household waste, and then I looked at Chase, who was scrolling through TikTok, the blue light of his expensive phone reflecting in his vacant, arrogant eyes. He was the investment, a failing asset being propped up by a home equity line of credit, while I was the liability that had to be suppressed before I could outshine the golden boy. The silence that followed her declaration was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of a neighbor's leaf blower. My mother took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving mine, waiting for me to break, waiting for the tears that she would undoubtedly use as further proof of my weakness. But the tears didn't come. Instead, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over me, a realization that the person standing in front of me wasn't a mother, but a warden. And this house wasn't a home, but a cage designed to keep me small enough to fit under her thumb. She truly believed that by withholding a signature and a few sheets of paper, she could extinguish the fire that had been burning in me since I was a child. She had no idea that I had already spent years studying the logistics of the very world she was trying to lock me out of, and that my rusted metal lockbox under the floorboards held more than just crumpled $12 an hour wages. It held the blueprint for my escape. I turned away from her without saying another word, ignoring the triumphant snicker that escaped Chase's throat, and I walked out of the kitchen with a posture that was straighter than it had been in years. I went to my room, the small space under the eaves that was already being measured for Julian's gym equipment, and I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter drifting up through the floorboards. They thought they had won because they held the legal documents and the credit lines, but they had forgotten that I was the one who managed the micro details of their lives. I knew the passwords to the utility accounts. I knew the schedule of the trash pickup. I knew the exact cost of the groceries they consumed, and I knew the breaking point of the colonial illusion they were living in. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. on my refurbished Lenovo laptop, researching the legal loopholes for students whose parents refuse to provide financial information, looking into dependency overrides and the grueling process of proving familial estrangement. The technical reality of my situation was bleak, as the financial aid office at Sinclair University had told me that without those tax returns, I was essentially a non-entity in the eyes of the Department of Education. My mother's refusal was a calculated move to keep me working at the retail shop or the diner, earning just enough to pay her a room and board fee that she had already threatened to implement the moment I turned 19. She wanted to turn me into a source of revenue, a way to offset the $680 monthly lease on Chase's Jeep and the interest on the $82,000 home equity line. As I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the pixelated screen of my laptop, I began to draft a different kind of manifest, not for a warehouse shipment, but for my own life. I realized that if she wouldn't give me the documents, I would have to find a way to exist outside of her shadow entirely, even if it meant working double shifts at the Miller Logistics warehouse until my hands bled and my spirit was pushed to the absolute limit. The image of my SAT book in the trash stayed with me, a vivid reminder of the grease and filth she was willing to throw over my aspirations. It was $35 that I had earned by folding sweaters and dealing with entitled customers at the mall for 3 hours, and she had discarded it as if it were a used napkin. But as the sun began to peek through the thin curtains of my room, casting long, pale shadows across the floorboards where my lockbox was hidden, I felt a surge of cold, calculated resolve. If I was a liability in her eyes, then I would become the most expensive liability she had ever encountered. I would let her believe she had won. I would continue to scrub the baseboards with diluted bleach until they gleamed like bone, and I would continue to fade into the background of their privileged lives. But every action I took from that moment forward was a tactical maneuver. I thought about the logistics of my identity, the way my name was tied to theirs in the eyes of the bank and the state, and I realized that my first step wasn't going to be a college application, but a total severance of the ties that bound my credit and my future to their sinking ship. Caroline's hollow laugh echoed in my mind throughout the following week, a constant reminder of the stakes. Every time I saw Chase smirking at his phone or heard the chime of a new Amazon delivery arriving for him, packages I was expected to bring inside and open, I added another layer to my plan. They had denied me a legal identity for the sake of Chase's elite prep year and his natural titanium iPhone, but in doing so, they had given me something far more dangerous, a reason to rebuild myself from scratch, without a single ounce of their influence or their poisoned money. I wasn't going to cosmetology school, and I wasn't going to spend my life at a diner. I was going to build an empire in the shadows of the very system they thought they had locked me out of. And the next time my mother saw my name, it wouldn't be on a FAFSA form, it would be on a building she couldn't afford to enter. The betrayal on that Tuesday at 6:14 p.m. was the final lesson I needed to learn about the nature of my family. It taught me that blood isn't a bond. It's just a biological coincidence, and that the people who share your DNA can be the most efficient architects of your destruction. I looked out my window at the quiet, manicured streets of West Hartford, where every house looked like a dream, and every driveway held a car that cost more than a year of my life, and I realized that I didn't belong here. I belonged in the grit, in the warehouses, in the places where value was created by sweat and data, not by home equity lines and stolen invitations. My name is Mila Joan, and while my mother thought she had deleted my existence, she had actually just forced me to become the sole author of my own story, a story that was about to become her worst nightmare. I sat in my 1998 Honda Civic that night, the engine idling with a rhythmic, metallic rattle that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones, staring at the amber glow of the check engine light as it flickered against the dashboard like a taunting ghost. The driveway of our Sycamore Drive home was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight reflecting off the pristine siding of the house and the sharp, clinical blue light emanating from Chase's bedroom window, where he was undoubtedly still awake, fueled by expensive energy drinks and the comfort of a future he hadn't earned. I had exactly $1,432.18 in my rusted metal lockbox, a sum I had counted 3 times until the texture of the bills felt like sand against my fingertips, and the cold reality of that number hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't enough for a single semester of tuition at even the humblest state college, let alone the 4-year degree I needed to dismantle the narrative my mother had constructed for me. And as I gripped the worn plastic of the steering wheel, I realized that the traditional path had been systematically blocked by a woman who viewed my ambition as a personal insult. I realized right then that if I wanted to escape this meticulously manicured cage without being crushed by the weight of their debt and their disdain, I had to become a ghost, a presence so quiet and so efficient that I could build an entire life in the margins of their awareness without them ever suspecting the shift in power. The decision felt like a cold internal snap, a final severance of the hope that I could ever be seen as a daughter in that house. And so I walked into my retail job the very next morning and quit without a second thought, trading the bright lights and artificial smiles of the West Farms Mall for the gritty industrial reality of a regional logistics hub in Windsor Locks. I took a graveyard shift that ran from midnight to 5 a.m., a brutal window of time that most people avoided like a plague. But for me, it was the perfect sanctuary because it allowed me to work while the rest of the world, including my mother and Chase, were fast asleep in their high thread count delusions. My new role involved entering shipping manifests for $18.50 an hour, a significant jump from my previous wage, and the work was a relentless stream of data entry, tracking the movement of thousands of units of freight across the Northeast Corridor. I decided right then that if they wanted me to be invisible, if they wanted to treat me like the background noise of their lives, then I would be the most productive and lethal shadow they had ever seen, using every hour of the night to harvest the knowledge and the capital I needed to stage my ultimate coup. The logistics hub was a cavernous, echoing space that smelled of diesel exhaust, cold concrete, and the ozone of heavy machinery, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented air of the colonial house I still technically inhabited. While my mother slept, dreaming of Chase's non-existent accolades, I was bathed in the harsh, flickering light of a dual-monitor setup, my fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard as I processed the lifeblood of the American economy. I wasn't just entering numbers into a database. I was studying the architecture of commerce, observing the way supply chains buckled under pressure, and the way a single misplaced digit could cost a company $20,000 in lost transit time. I became obsessed with the efficiency of the operation, staying late to talk to the truck drivers who pulled in with 2024 Freightliner Cascadia rigs, asking them about the software they used for route optimization and the hidden costs of idling in traffic on I-95. I was making more money than I ever had, but I lived as if I were destitute, keeping my thrifted sweaters and my crumbling Honda, funneling every single cent of that $18.50 an hour into a high-yield savings account that my mother didn't even know existed because I had used a P.O. box in another town for all my banking correspondence. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., I would drive back to West Hartford just as the first gray light of dawn was hitting the rooftops, parking my rattling Civic 3 houses down so the sound of the engine wouldn't wake my mother and give away my new schedule. I would slip through the back door like a thief, my clothes smelling of the warehouse, and I would head straight for the laundry room to wash away the industrial grime before I had to start my daily chores of scrubbing the baseboards and preparing the house for her morning inspection. I was living a double life, a phantom who functioned as a servant by day and a data architect by night, fueled by black coffee and the burning, incandescent rage of knowing that my mother was currently using her $82,000 credit line to buy Chase a set of custom-tailored suits for interviews he would never actually attend. The physical toll was immense, a constant, low-grade exhaustion that made my vision blur at the edges. But the psychological payoff was even greater because every entry I made into the manifest was a step closer to a world where Caroline Joan had no power over me. I remember one particular night in October when a massive storm had knocked out the power in half the state, and the logistics hub was running on emergency generators, the red lights casting long, eerie shadows across the rows of desks. The system had glitched, threatening to stall a shipment of temperature-sensitive medical supplies destined for Hartford Hospital, and the floor manager was sweating through his shirt, frantically trying to manually reroute the trucks. I didn't wait for instructions. I used the Python scripts I had been practicing on my pawnshop laptop to bridge the data gap, bypassing the corrupted manifest and generating a temporary routing table that kept the fleet moving. The manager looked at me as if I had just performed a miracle, not realizing that I had been preparing for a moment like this for months, treating every shift like a high-stakes simulation of my own survival. He didn't know my name was Mila. He just knew I was the girl in the oversized hoodie who never spoke but always delivered, a ghost in the machine who understood the value of $1 and the cost of a delay better than anyone in the front office. Back at the house, the atmosphere remained a toxic blend of arrogance and ignorance as my mother continued to parade Chase around like a prize pony, oblivious to the fact that their financial foundation was rotting from the inside out. I watched as she signed off on a $4,000 weekend trip to New York City so Chase could network with some of my father's old associates, money that came directly from the home equity line that was supposed to be the safety net for our home. I stood in the kitchen, my eyes heavy from the graveyard shift, and I watched her hand him the credit card with a smile of such pure, misguided hope that it almost made me pity her, until I remembered the way she had swiped my SAT book into the trash. She still thought I was working 20 hours a week at the mall, still thought I was the liability that she could exploit for domestic labor, and I let her believe it because the more she underestimated me, the more room I had to move in the shadows. I was building an empire out of $18 increments, a slow and agonizing process of accumulation that required a level of discipline that Chase couldn't even fathom. And every time I heard him complaining about the lack of high-speed internet or the quality of the groceries, I just tightened my grip on my secret bank statement. The 1998 Honda Civic became my mobile command center, the place where I would sit between shifts and map out my 5-year plan with a level of technical detail that included projected inflation rates and the cost of living in 3 different cities. I knew that my $1,400 had grown to nearly $7,000 in just a few months of obsessive overtime and zero spending, a small fortune that represented my first real leverage against the world. I would stare at that check engine light, which stayed on despite my best efforts to ignore it, and I would remind myself that the light was a metaphor for my life at Sycamore Drive, a warning that the entire system was failing and that I needed to be clear of the blast zone when it finally seized up. I wasn't just a girl in a dented car anymore. I was a ghost who had learned how to manipulate the flow of goods and information, a silent partner in the very industries that my mother's social circle only viewed as a convenience. There were mornings when I would be so tired that I would lean my forehead against the cool glass of the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood wake up, and I would feel a sense of profound isolation, knowing that I was the only person in a 3-mile radius who truly knew what it felt like to be erased. But then I would think about the logistics hub, the rhythmic beep of the forklifts, and the cold, hard data on my screen, and I would feel a surge of power that no Chanel suit or second mortgage could ever provide. I was becoming the person I was meant to be, not through the grace of a mother's love or the support of a college fund, but through the sheer, unadulterated force of my own will and the opportunities I found in the dark hours of the night. Caroline wanted me to be a liability. She wanted me to be the overhead that she could write off. But I was transforming into a master of efficiency, a strategist who was learning how to turn her neglect into my greatest competitive advantage. The ghost was getting stronger, the shadows were getting deeper, and as I heard the heavy footsteps of my brother finally waking up at noon to start another day of doing nothing, I allowed myself a single, cold smile, knowing that the time for my manifestation was drawing closer with every barcode I scanned and every manifest I closed. I was no longer just Mila Joan, the girl who flipped burgers in her mother's imagination. I was the architect of a silent revolution, and by the time they realized I was gone, I would already be miles ahead of them, driving a future they could never afford to touch. For 18 grueling months, I lived a double life that was as meticulously structured as the global logistics manifests I processed during the graveyard shift. A life where every move was a calculated play in a game of survival my mother didn't even know we were playing. To facilitate my escape and maintain absolute operational security within the walls of the Sycamore Drive house, I purchased a $45 prepaid burner phone from a CVS in New Britain, using it as my sole line of communication with my high school guidance counselor, Mr. Harrison, who was the only person in the world who knew the true depth of the financial and psychological warfare being waged against me. I spent exactly $127 on the filing and processing fees for a dependency override application, a grueling legal and administrative process that required me to document every single instance of financial abuse and parental abandonment in a level of detail that made my stomach turn every time I opened the file. I compiled a mountain of evidence, including bank statements from my secret account that proved I had paid for 100% of my own food, gas, and basic necessities since the day I turned 18, while my mother was busy liquidating our home's equity to fund Chase's life of leisure. I kept my growing war chest in a private credit union account across town, a small brick-and-forth branch of the American Eagle Federal Credit Union, where I had physically walked in and explained to a sympathetic teller that I needed a zero correspondence account with no paper trail ever sent to my home address. My nights were a blur of high-stakes logistics at the warehouse and high-stakes academia in the small hours of the morning, where I studied for 5 different advanced placement exams under the weight of a $20 weighted blanket I'd found on clearance, using a tactical LED flashlight with a focused beam so that not a single sliver of light would leak under my bedroom door to alert my mother that I was still awake. The flashlight, a rugged black aluminum tool I'd bought for $19 at a hardware store, became my most intimate companion as I pored over calculus and macroeconomics textbooks until my eyes burned and the text began to swim on the page. I was perpetually exhausted, my body operating on a dangerously thin margin of 4 hours of fragmented sleep and cup after cup of black coffee from the warehouse break room that tasted like burnt rubber and industrial chemicals. But the physical toll was secondary to the numbers appearing on my mobile banking app. By the time April of my second gap year rolled around, that secret account hit the $12,000 mark, a figure that represented thousands of pallets wrapped, tens of thousands of data entries made, and a million moments of biting my tongue while my mother praised Chase for finally finishing a single practice essay for his tutors. The sheer technicality of my existence during those 18 months was a masterclass in endurance, as I had to account for every minute of my day to ensure that my mother still believed I was the subservient, low-earning retail worker she wanted me to be. I would purposely leave old mall pay stubs from my previous job lying around, stubs that showed a meager $200 weekly take-home, while my actual earnings from the logistics hub were nearly triple that amount, safely tucked away where she could never touch them. I meticulously tracked the mileage on my 1998 Honda Civic, knowing that if I drove too much, she might question where I was going, so I often parked a mile away from the warehouse and walked the rest of the distance in the biting Connecticut wind just to keep the odometer from revealing my true movements. Every dollar I saved felt like a bullet in a magazine I was loading for the day I would finally fire back, and I treated my financial spreadsheets with more reverence than any family heirloom in that house. I knew the exact cost of a gallon of milk at the Aldi 4 miles away versus the Stop and Shop on the corner, and I chose the cheaper option every time, even if it meant a longer drive, because a saved 70 cents was 70 cents closer to a university tuition that didn't require my mother's poisoned signature. In the house, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly surreal as the reality of the home equity line of credit began to catch up with my mother's spending habits, though she refused to acknowledge the looming shadow of the $82,000 debt she had incurred for Chase. I watched her buy him a set of noise-canceling Bose headphones for $350, because he complained that the sound of my morning cleaning was distracting him from his rest, and I felt a cold, sharp sense of triumph knowing that the headphones were essentially being paid for with interest that would eventually drown them both. My dependency override packet was now over 60 pages long, containing sworn affidavits from Silas at the warehouse and a local librarian who had witnessed my mother's public outbursts regarding my worthlessness, all curated to prove to the Department of Education that I was an independent entity in every sense of the word. I was building a legal and financial fortress around myself, brick by grueling brick, while my mother and Chase were busy decorating a house of cards that was one strong breeze away from total collapse. The physical environment of my room during those study sessions was a stark contrast to the rest of the colonial. While the downstairs was filled with polished mahogany and sea salt candles, my corner under the eaves was a command center of grit and determination. My LED flashlight illuminated the complexities of supply chain management and the laws of thermodynamics, subjects I mastered not for a grade, but because I knew they were the keys to a world where data was the only currency that mattered. I became an expert in the logistics of my own life, calculating the caloric density of the cheapest food I could buy to ensure I had enough energy for the graveyard shift without spending more than $40 a week on groceries. I felt like a deep sea diver, living in a high-pressure environment where one mistake in my double life could lead to a catastrophic breach, but the $12,000 in my war chest acted as my oxygen supply, keeping me conscious even when the exhaustion threatened to pull me under. I remember a night in late March when the heating system in the house failed, and my mother refused to call a repairman because she had just spent $1,500 on a celebratory dinner for Chase's birthday, a dinner I wasn't invited to. I sat in my room, wrapped in my weighted blanket with my tactical light shining on a practice exam, my breath hitching in the cold air, and I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound sense of clarity. I realized that they were already living in the ruins of their own making, while I was the only one in the house who was truly warm, fueled by the internal heat of a plan that was reaching its boiling point. My mother's laughter from downstairs, fueled by expensive wine and the delusion of Chase's success, sounded like a fading signal from a dying planet, while my burner phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Harrison telling me that my override was looking positive. I was no longer a victim of their hierarchy. I was an independent contractor temporarily residing in a hostile territory, and my $12,000 balance was the proof of my victory. The black coffee I drank became a ritual, a bitter reminder of the price of freedom, and as I sat in the warehouse office at 3 a.m. entering the manifests for a fleet of trucks heading to Boston, I realized I was already more of a professional than my brother would ever be with all his elite prep. I was learning the value of time, the weight of a dollar, and the absolute necessity of a silence that works in your favor, a lesson that my mother had inadvertently taught me by trying to erase my voice. April was the turning point, the month where the shadows I had been living in began to recede, revealing the path toward the commencement stage I would eventually occupy. Every hour of missed sleep, every cold morning scrubbing the floors, and every dollar diverted into the secret credit union account was a testament to a girl who refused to be a liability and instead chose to become a force of nature. I looked at the green digits on my burner phone, seeing the time hit 4 a.m., and I knew that while the rest of Sycamore Drive was dreaming, I was the only one truly awake, and the empire I had built in the shadows was finally ready to be brought into the light. The trap was set on a humid Thursday afternoon in late May, the very day the mail carrier's truck rattled up Sycamore Drive and deposited 2 thick, identical cream-colored envelopes from Sinclair University into our black locking mailbox. I saw the mail truck from the kitchen window while I was scrubbing a stubborn pasta stain off the stovetop, and I moved with the silent, practiced speed of a ghost to intercept the mail before my mother could claim it. I stepped onto the porch, the heat of the pavement radiating through the thin soles of my sneakers, and pulled the envelopes out. One was addressed to Chase Mitchell, and the other, miraculously, was addressed to Mila Joan. My heart performed a violent, rhythmic thud against my ribs as I slid my envelope, the physical proof of my 18 months of clandestine labor and the success of my dependency override, into the waistband of my jeans, pulling my oversized thrifted sweater down to conceal the sharp edges of the heavy cardstock. My mother, Caroline, was already in a state of performative hysteria, having spent $450 on a lavish congratulations Chase catering spread from La Petite Boulangerie, a local French bakery that specialized in the kind of delicate fruit tarts and almond croissants that she believed signaled high social standing. She had her silver iPhone 14 Pro mounted on a tripod, the camera lens polished and recording for her 412 Facebook friends, her face glowing with a predatory, reflected glory that she fully expected to harvest from her golden son's imminent triumph. I stood in the far corner of the sunroom, a silent and nearly invisible observer in my $12 steel-toed work boots that still bore the faint gray dust of the Miller Logistics warehouse floor, watching as Chase prepared to open the door I had already walked through in the middle of the night. Chase was dressed in a brand-new linen shirt that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, his hair professionally styled and a smirk of unearned confidence plastered across his face as he reached for the envelope sitting on the mahogany coffee table. My mother was narrating the video in a hushed, reverent tone, telling her digital audience that this was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment that the $82,000 investment in Chase's future finally bore fruit. She didn't even glance toward the corner where I stood, the hidden envelope against my skin feeling like a live wire, a secret weapon that was about to detonate the entire foundation of her carefully curated reality. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive vanilla candles and the sugary aroma of the tarts, a cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn as I realized how much they had staked on a boy who had spent his prep year playing video games and draining a home equity line. Chase slid his finger under the flap of the envelope with a flourish, his eyes darting to the camera to ensure his best angle was captured, while my mother held her breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the tripod. I watched his face transition from arrogant expectation to a confused, blank stare as he pulled out a single sheet of paper that was decidedly not an acceptance letter, but a formal rejection notice citing his failure to meet the minimum academic threshold despite his expensive tutoring. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the central air conditioning and the distant chirping of a neighbor's lawnmower, a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the very air out of the room. Caroline's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated, her features contorting into a mask of disbelief and burgeoning rage as she snatched the letter from Chase's limp hand, her eyes scanning the text for a mistake that wasn't there. She looked at the $450 worth of French pastries, then at the recording phone, and finally at her son, who was already looking for a way to blame the university, the mailman, or the proctors for his own spectacular failure to launch. I felt the weight of my own envelope against my hip, the thick cream paper containing my valedictorian scholarship offer and a full admission to the School of Business and Logistics, a document that represented every 3 a.m. study session and every manifest I had ever typed into a glowing screen. My mother turned her gaze toward me then, not out of love or a sudden realization of my worth, but because she needed a target for the humiliation that was currently flooding her system like a toxin. She began to scream, her voice high and shrill, accusing me of being a jinx, of bringing my low-class warehouse energy into the house and ruining Chase's big moment with my very presence. She didn't know that the girl she was berating was the only person in the room who had actually secured a seat at that university, and she certainly didn't know that I had already paid my housing deposit with the money I had hoarded in my secret credit union account. I stood there, my posture straight and my expression neutral, letting her words wash over me like a harmless rain, because I knew that in exactly 3 minutes, I was going to pull that envelope from my waistband and end the charade once and for all. The contrast between the two of us in that moment was a technical marvel of social engineering. Chase was the peak of an artificial hierarchy built on debt and delusion, while I was the byproduct of a survivalist grind that had turned me into a precision instrument. My mother grabbed a raspberry tart and threw it against the wall in a fit of pique, the red filling staining the pale gray paint like a wound, and she demanded to know why I was smiling, though my face hadn't moved a muscle. I reached back, the movement slow and deliberate, and I felt the crisp texture of the Sinclair University logo through my jeans as I prepared to reveal the truth that would bankrupt her pride. I thought about the $1,200 iPhone Chase was still clutching, the $82,000 debt that was now a black hole in their finances, and the 18 months I had spent as a ghost in my own home, and I realized that the trap hadn't been set by me, but by their own refusal to see the value in anything that wasn't a reflection of themselves. The camera was still recording, the little red light blinking like a heartbeat, capturing the exact moment that the overhead became the owner and the investment became the liability. I pulled the envelope out and held it up in the soft afternoon light, the Sinclair seal shimmering with a quiet, undeniable authority that silenced my mother's tirade mid-sentence. I didn't say a word. I just watched as her eyes locked onto the return address, her brain struggling to reconcile the sight of the elite university's logo with the daughter she had relegated to the shadows and the grease-stained trash cans. Chase looked up from his rejection letter, his mouth agape, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his face as he realized that the sister he had mocked was now the only one with a future that didn't involve a retail shift or a dead-end job. The technical reality of the situation was settling in. I had bypassed their gatekeeping, I had secured my own funding, and I had done it all while scrubbing their floors and living on 4 hours of sleep. Caroline took a step toward me, her hand reaching out for the envelope as if she could somehow claim my success as her own. But I stepped back, tucking the letter back into my pocket with a finality that felt like a gavel striking a bench. The catering spread sat untouched on the table, the expensive almond croissants slowly cooling in the humid air, a feast for a king who had no kingdom and a son who had no crown. My mother's Facebook livestream was still active, and I wondered if her friends could see the sheer, unadulterated shock on her face the moment she realized that she had spent $82,000 to prove that her golden boy was a fraud while her liability was a prodigy. I looked at the $12 work boots on my feet, the boots that had carried me through the graveyard shifts and the industrial noise, and I felt a sense of pride that no $4,000 Chanel suit could ever bestow. I was Mila Joan, and I wasn't just a student. I was a strategist who had executed a perfect maneuver in the dark, and as I walked out of the sunroom and toward the stairs to pack the rest of my belongings into my 1998 Honda Civic, I knew that the colonial house on Sycamore Drive was no longer my prison, but a museum of a life I had officially outgrown. The air outside was starting to cool as the sun dipped behind the Connecticut tree line, but the interior of the house remained a furnace of resentment and failed expectations. I could hear my mother starting to weep now, not for me and the struggle I had endured, but for the loss of the story she wanted to tell the world about her perfect family and her elite son. She had ignored the data, she had ignored the logistics of character and work ethic, and she had bet everything on a brand that had no substance behind it. As I loaded the last of my thrifted sweaters and my tactical LED flashlight into the trunk of my car, the check engine light was the only thing I had left to worry about, and even that felt like a minor technicality compared to the vast, open road of my own making. I was a ghost no longer. I was a physical presence with a cream-colored envelope and a $12,000 war chest, and the world was finally going to have to deal with me on my terms, without a second mortgage or a mother's permission. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine groaning to life with its familiar rattle, and I didn't look back at the sunroom where the camera was likely still recording the ruins of a dream that was never mine to begin with. The moment of execution was as cold and precise as a surgical strike, occurring in the heart of our sunroom where the afternoon light hit the dust motes dancing over the $450 catering spread. Chase, clutching the cream-colored Sinclair University envelope with fingers that had never known a day of real labor, finally tore the seal with a jagged, trembling motion that signaled the end of his unearned confidence. I watched his face transition from a mask of smug, inherited superiority to a ghostly, translucent pale in exactly 4.2 seconds, as his eyes scanned the single sheet of paper that would redefine his entire existence. "We regret to inform you that we are unable to offer you admission to the class of 2028, he whispered, the words barely audible over the high-pitched mechanical hum of our sub-zero refrigerator that seemed to grow deafening in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the room. He had been rejected, not just by an institution, but by the very myth of greatness my mother had spent $82,000 of our home's equity to maintain, and the weight of that failure seemed to physically shrink him as he stood there in his linen shirt. The silence was so thick it felt pressurized, a suffocating atmosphere where the only thing moving was the little red recording light on my mother's tripod-mounted iPhone, still broadcasting the collapse of her dynasty to her 400 Facebook friends. Caroline didn't offer a hug or a word of comfort. Instead, her disappointment curdled instantly into a screeching, dissonant rage that shattered the quiet as she began screaming at the empty air, calling the Sinclair admissions office elitist snobs and incompetent bureaucrats who wouldn't know real talent if it hit them in the face. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her heels clicking like gunfire, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of indignant fury, while Chase sat slumped on the mahogany coffee table, the rejection letter fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. That was the exact moment I chose to break my 18 months of strategic silence, reaching into the waistband of my jeans and pulling out my own heavy, cream-colored envelope, which had stayed warm against my skin throughout their performative celebration. I didn't say a single word as I stepped forward into the center of the room, my $12 steel-toed work boots leaving a faint trail of warehouse grit on the polished floorboards I had spent my life scrubbing. With a deliberate, steady hand, I laid my official acceptance and full presidential scholarship letter directly onto the table, placing it right next to the $60 vanilla bean cake from La Petite Boulangerie that was now a monument to a non-existent victory. "I start in August," I said, my voice sounding incredibly calm and resonant in the wake of her screaming, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy vibrating through the sunroom. My mother froze mid-stride, her mouth hanging open as she stared at the Sinclair seal on my letter, her brain struggling to process the technical impossibility of the girl she called a liability, achieving the very thing her golden investment could not. "And since I am apparently not college material and destined to flip burgers," I continued, looking her directly in the eye with a level of clarity that made her flinch, "you won't mind that I have already signed the lease on my own apartment in the South End using the $15,000 I earned at the logistics hub while you thought I was upstairs sleeping." The realization hit her like a physical blow, the color draining from her face as she looked from my scholarship letter to my work boots, finally seeing the ghost who had been building an empire in the shadows of her neglect. I watched as she tried to find a way to claim credit for my success, her eyes darting toward the camera as if she could pivot the narrative, but the documentation on the table was too absolute, and the $15,000 in my private account was a wall she could never climb over. The technicality of my departure was already finalized. I had the keys to a 480-square-foot studio in a renovated industrial building in my pocket, a space that cost me $1,400 a month, but represented a level of freedom that was priceless. While they were drowning in the interest of an $82,000 home equity line that had yielded nothing but a rejection letter, I was standing on a foundation of cold, hard cash and a full-ride scholarship that covered every cent of my $112,000 education. Chase looked up at me then, his expression a mixture of envy and genuine terror, because he realized for the first time that the hierarchy of Sycamore Drive was a lie, and that the person who held the true power in the house was the girl he had spent his life ignoring. My mother's hand reached out for the letter, her fingers trembling with the urge to tear it as she had torn my SAT book, but I reclaimed it before she could touch the paper, folding it neatly and tucking it back into my pocket with a finality that signaled the end of our shared history. I told them that my bags were already packed in the trunk of my 1998 Honda Civic and that the 6 a.m. scrubbing sessions were officially over, leaving the vanilla cake and the French pastries to rot in the afternoon heat of a house that was no longer my home. As I walked toward the front door, the silence behind me was replaced by the sound of my mother finally turning off the camera, the performative glow of her life extinguished in a single click as the reality of her financial and emotional bankruptcy settled into the room. I didn't look back at the colonial architecture or the manicured lawn that I had mowed for years. I only looked forward to the rattling dashboard of my car and the $15,000 war chest that was my ticket to a world where my name meant something more than overhead. The $15,000 wasn't just money. It was 3,240 hours of graveyard shifts. It was 1,000,000 barcodes scanned, and it was the physical manifestation of a girl who refused to be deleted by a woman who valued appearances over substance. I drove out of the driveway of the $850,000 house with exactly $843 in my pocket when I first left. But today, I was leaving with a fortune in resilience and a future that was entirely, legally, and undeniably mine. The engine of my Civic groaned as I hit 40 miles per hour, the check engine light still glowing like a tiny amber sun. But for the first time in 22 years, I knew exactly where I was going, and I knew that I was the only one capable of driving myself there. The transition from the sunroom to the driver's seat felt like emerging from a pressurized chamber into the open air, the scent of expensive sea salt candles replaced by the honest smell of old upholstery and the gasoline of my own independence. I could almost feel the weight of the second mortgage lifting from my shoulders because I was no longer the collateral for their delusions, no longer the servant who kept the museum of their failures sparkling at 6 a.m. In the south end of Hartford, my new apartment was waiting, a space with exposed brick and high ceilings that echoed the industrial aesthetic of the warehouse where I had earned my freedom, a place where no one would ever tell me I was a liability again. My mother and Chase were left in the ruins of their elite prep year, clutching a rejection letter that cost them $82,000, while I was moving into a future that was fully funded by the grit she tried to scrub out of me. As I turned onto the main road, leaving the quiet cul-de-sacs of West Hartford behind, I realized that family isn't the blood that flows through your veins, but the people who recognize your worth before you have to prove it with a $15,000 bank statement and a valedictorian medal. I was Mila Joan, and the girl who was destined to flip burgers had just become the architect of her own destiny, leaving a trail of shattered expectations and a $60 vanilla cake in her rearview mirror. The technical specifications of my new life were already mapped out on a spreadsheet in my mind. I knew my course load for the first semester, I knew the bus routes to the Sinclair campus, and I knew exactly how long my $15,000 would last if I maintained my disciplined spending habits. I was entering the School of Business and Logistics as a veteran of the field, not as a sheltered student, and the professors would soon realize that the girl in the back of the room knew more about supply chain efficiency than the textbooks could ever teach. My mother's laughter from that Tuesday at 6:14 p.m. was now nothing more than a faint, distorted echo, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of my tires on the pavement and the knowledge that I had won the war she started. She had tried to deny me a legal identity, but in doing so, she had forced me to forge one that was unbreakable, tempered in the heat of the warehouse and polished in the silence of the night. As the sun began to set over the Connecticut skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the highway, I realized that I wasn't just escaping a house. I was launching an empire, and the first order of business was to never, ever look back at the woman who thought she could spend my future on her son's failures. The $82,000 home equity line was now a ticking time bomb for my parents, a financial reality that would eventually force them to sell the very colonial house they used as a weapon against me. But that was a logistics problem I no longer had to solve. My concern was the upcoming orientation at Sinclair and the keys to my new apartment that felt heavy and substantial in my palm, a physical proof of ownership that no one could take away with a swipe of a trash can. I thought of the 80 thread count sheets Chase was likely still lying on, and I smiled, knowing that I would rather sleep on the floor of my own studio than in a palace built on my own subjugation. The girl they tried to make invisible was now the only one with a clear path forward, a shadow that had finally stepped into the light and found that the light belonged to her all along. My name is Mila Joan, and this wasn't just a graduation or an acceptance. It was a total and absolute divestment from a toxic enterprise, and as I pulled into the parking lot of my new building, I knew that the best part of my story was just beginning. The aftermath of that afternoon in the sunroom was as cold and clinical as the logistics manifests I had spent 18 months mastering, a final and absolute separation that required no further dialogue or emotional outbursts. I moved out that very night, the humid Connecticut air clinging to my skin as I carried the last of my belongings to my 1998 Honda Civic. The car loaded so heavily that the rear bumper nearly scraped the asphalt of the driveway I would never park in again. I didn't wait for a goodbye from my mother, Caroline, who was still sequestered in the kitchen amidst the ruins of her $450 catering spread, and I certainly didn't seek out Chase, who was likely still staring at his rejection letter in a state of catatonic shock. I took my $45 burner phone, the one that had been my lifeline to a future she tried to sabotage, and I used it to block my mother's primary number, her work line, and even the landline of the house on Sycamore Drive, a digital erasure that preceded the physical one. I haven't spoken a single word to her in 4 years, a span of time during which I transformed from the ghost in her hallway into a woman whose name carries weight in the corporate corridors she only ever dreamed of entering through association. The only interaction we have had since that day occurred a month ago on the commencement stage of Sinclair University, where I stood as the valedictorian with a gold stole draped over my shoulders and a heavy silver medal around my neck. And as I walked to the podium to deliver my address, I looked directly through her as if she were nothing more than a pane of glass, a transparent and irrelevant relic of a life I had systematically dismantled to save myself. While I was building my empire, the hierarchy of our old home continued its inevitable slide into technical and financial obsolescence, with Chase currently mired in his 4th consecutive gap year, a term that has become a euphemism for his inability to function without the safety net of a mother who has nothing left to give but her own resentment. He lives in the basement of that same 1,800-square-foot colonial, a space that was once intended to be a trophy room, but is now a damp sanctuary for his failed business ventures and the expensive gaming equipment that was bought with the last of the home equity line of credit. My father and mother are reportedly struggling to keep up with the interest payments on that $82,000 debt, a financial reality that I track with a purely analytical interest, as if I am observing the bankruptcy of a competitor that failed to adapt to a changing market. Meanwhile, I have just finalized the digital signature on an employment contract with a global supply chain firm in Manhattan, a position that carries a $115,000 base salary, a $10,000 signing bonus, and a comprehensive benefits package that includes stock options and a premium health plan that is a far cry from the days when I couldn't afford a single bottle of ibuprofen. My new home, a high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the skyline, is quiet, clean, and entirely mine, a space where the air is never thick with the scent of diluted bleach or the suffocating weight of someone else's expectations. The journey from the graveyard shift at the Windsor Locks warehouse to the executive suite was not a stroke of luck, but a relentless series of tactical maneuvers that required me to become a total stranger to the people who shared my DNA but never my values. I remember the exact moment I realized that my survival depended on my invisibility, and I have carried that lesson into my professional life, where I am known for my ability to identify inefficiencies and execute solutions with a level of precision that my colleagues find almost unnerving. I still have the rusted metal lockbox, though it is no longer hidden under floorboards. It sits on my mahogany bookshelf as a reminder of the $1,432.18 that served as the seed money for my freedom. Every time I see a 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe or a black Jeep Grand Cherokee in the city, I am reminded of the $680 monthly leases that my mother prioritized over my education, and I feel a surge of cold, quiet satisfaction knowing that I own my life outright, without a single cent of borrowed prestige. The 18 months of 4-hour sleep cycles and black coffee that tasted like burnt rubber were the cost of admission to a reality where I am the sole arbiter of my worth. A reality where the daughter who was destined to flip burgers is now the one managing the logistics of companies that once seemed like distant galaxies. The silence of my current life is not a lonely one, but a hard-earned peace that serves as the foundation for everything I am still building, a testament to the fact that blood is a biological technicality, while character is a deliberate construction. I have surrounded myself with people who understand that family is defined by loyalty and mutual respect, not by second mortgages and performative Facebook posts, and I have found a level of professional success that Caroline Joan could never have imagined for a girl she considered a liability. I often think about the $60 vanilla cake and the way it looked sitting next to my scholarship letter, a symbol of a hierarchy that was inverted in a single afternoon of cold, hard truth. My mother likely still tells people a version of the story where I am the ungrateful daughter who turned her back on a loving home. But she cannot change the data. She cannot delete the fact that I succeeded not because of her, but in spite of the very walls she tried to use to cage me. I have become a master of the shadows and the light, a woman who knows exactly what it costs to survive, and even more about what it takes to thrive in a world that wasn't built for people like me. The technical specifications of my career are impressive on paper, but the true metric of my success is the fact that I can walk through my own front door and feel a sense of absolute security that was never present on Sycamore Drive. I am 22 years old, and I have already survived the worst betrayal a child can face, emerging with a war chest that is now valued in 6 figures and a mind that is sharper than any blade my mother ever tried to use against me. Chase will likely spend the rest of his life in that basement, a victim of the very indulgence that was supposed to make him great, while I continue to move forward with the momentum of 1,000 graveyard shifts and the clarity of a person who has seen the bottom and decided to own the top. I have saved my future by cutting out the rot, a clinical and necessary procedure that allowed the rest of my life to finally begin. And as I look at the employment contract on my screen, I know that I am no longer a liability. I am the most significant asset in my own world. The choice to become a stranger was the most difficult logistics problem I ever solved, but the return on investment has been infinite, providing me with a life that is as expansive and real as the one they tried to keep me from. My name is Mila Joan, and the girl who was erased is now the one writing the history of everything that comes next, a story of resilience that required no one's permission to be told. I have learned that the world of high-stakes logistics and the world of human emotion operate on the same fundamental principle. You cannot manage what you do not accurately measure, and for 22 years, my family measured me by the wrong metrics entirely. They saw the thrifted sweaters and the $12 work boots and failed to see the architectural mind that was mapping the roots to a different life. They saw the 6 a.m. scrubbing as a duty rather than a discipline, never realizing that the very chores they used to keep me small were the ones teaching me the endurance I would need to outwork everyone in my path. Now, when I look at my mother's blocked contact in my phone, I don't feel anger or even sadness. I feel the same sense of detachment I would feel for a piece of faulty equipment that was long ago removed from the line for the safety of the operation. My home is a sanctuary of my own design, where the baseboards are clean because I choose to keep them that way, and where the only voices that echo are the ones that recognize the value of a hard-earned win. The $13,000 that once felt like an impossible summit in my secret credit union account has grown into a financial independence that allows me to look at the future with a level of calm that Caroline could never buy with her second mortgage. I am the valedictorian of my own life, a graduate of a school of hard knocks that had much higher tuition than Sinclair University could ever charge, and I have paid every cent of that bill in sweat and silence. I am moving into the next chapter with the confidence of someone who has already faced the monster in the sunroom and walked away without a scratch, leaving behind the vanilla cake and the failed golden boy to settle into the dust of their own making. This life is quiet, this life is clean, and most importantly, this life is legally, technically, and emotionally mine, a final manifest that has been signed, sealed, and delivered by my own hand. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And as I stand in my new kitchen, looking out at the city I have conquered, I realize that the person who stayed for me was always me. And that was more than enough to build an empire.